In a flooded dystopian Earth, 4 soldiers stranded in the middle of the ocean are entrusted with control of a nuclear bomb, which tests their trust amidst a war between 2 remaining countries. Human activity has caused a massive rise in sea level, flooding most of the planet. Survival is a constant fight for land and resources. 2 continents, the Northland and Southland, remain at war. Corporal Cassidy, Engineer Baines, and Private Sullivan are on the lower level of the Sentinel, Southland's military outpost, preparing for an incoming tidal wave. As they work, they also celebrate some fish brought in by the strong waves. Then Baines goes up to the upper level to stow the recent salvage and send the winch back down. In the communications room, Sergeant Hendricks informs them that a wave is about to hit. Sullivan is distracted by its size, causing the caught fish to be swept away. They send up what's left before climbing to safety. Meanwhile, as Baines secures the generator, pipes start to spring leaks. Despite his efforts, the water rises quickly and he's forced to abandon the repairs. After the wave hits, Sullivan and Cassidy are disappointed to see that nothing was left of their catch. The next day, Baines manages to get the generator running while Hendricks checks on Martha, the Sentinel's nuclear bomb. In the mess hall, Hendricks and Cassidy assess their situation. However, since they're already 3 months overdue for relief, they have limited resources. Sullivan serves the food, and Baines is disappointed to see it's all rations. He asks where's the fish, and the private replies that it's gone. Frustrated, Baines expresses his urge to leave, presenting that their base is leaning by showing a spherical food that rolls off the table, and questions why they can't confirm when relief is coming. Hendricks states that their satellite is only for reporting events. During his comm shift, Sullivan logs the incoming messages while Hendricks keeps watch on the roof. Then, Cassidy arrives to relieve the private. Elsewhere, Baines prepares the iodine they use to counteract radiation poisoning before continuing his woodworking. On the roof, Sullivan relieves Hendricks of watch duty and asks about the Northlanders. Instead of answering, the sergeant draws attention to Peter, the inflatable man, saying it has no place on a military outpost. Shortly after, the private calls Hendricks back and points to something in the distance. The sergeant radios Cassidy to check the radar and summons Baines. Sullivan believes it's their relief, but the sergeant sticks to protocol and orders him to man the gun. Cassidy hails the unknown vessel, but there's no response. On the roof, Sullivan informs the engineer that their relief is in sight, but that they have to follow protocol. After unsuccessful attempts to hail the vessel, Cassidy reports to the PA system. With no reply, Hendricks orders Sullivan to inspect the vessel, passing him his gun. Sullivan rides a boat and circles the vessel called Aurora before boarding and radios back that he sees no signs of life. To avoid detection, he turns off the radio. Sullivan realizes that the ship has been powerless and abandoned for some time. As he investigates, Hendricks becomes increasingly worried of the radio silence and heads to comms to activate Martha. However, Cassidy hesitates to comply when she sees his intentions. Meanwhile, Sullivan discovers a stockpile of rations and 4 sets of unused gear. Despite her attempts to dissuade him, Hendricks goes through the process of activating Martha. Fortunately, the private turns on the radio in time to hear Hendricks' warning and immediately responds. After deactivating Martha, Hendricks swears both security keys, stating protocol doesn't allow for hesitation. Sullivan tows the Aurora to the Sentinel and hands back Hendricks' gun. Under his breath, he remarks that the sergeant is crazy for activating Martha over something trivial. That night, while Cassidy reminisces about her family, Sullivan enters the infirmary and spends an intimate moment with her. The following day, during the crew's iodine bath, Baines reports that the Aurora has been inactive for months. Still, Sullivan maintains that the vessel was their relief, referring to the rations and unused gear. As Hendricks tries himself, the private insists that the Aurora needs to be reported. Hendricks disagrees, saying they will report it only after he's done inspecting it. Before exiting, the sergeant dons both security keys and instructs Baines to prepare the vessel for inspection. Sullivan is taken aback at seeing Hendricks with both keys. Later, Baines manages to restore power to the Aurora, and the sergeant immediately lists down its recent GPS coordinates. Afterwards, Hendricks takes down the map and comms just as their routine connection comes in and the private still doesn't report the mysterious appearance of the drifting vessel to their colleagues off base. However, he stays there battling with the idea. That night, Hendricks begins plotting Aurora's GPS coordinates. Meanwhile, Cassidy prepares to take watch while Sullivan gets ready for some rest. He presents her with a gift, a small metal ball with holes, though he admits not knowing what it is. As Sullivan passes the watch, he suggests something they could do once they return home, but Cassidy cuts him off, saying they don't even know when that'll happen. Hearing this, the private tells her that they'll know tomorrow, confessing that he sent a message during his shift. That night, Cassidy is left speechless during her watch. The next day, Hendricks is surprised to see his men gathered and orders Baines to explain. The engineer hesitates for a moment before reporting the situation that his colleague sent an inquiry about the relief. While Sullivan is disappointed by the betrayal, the computer begins beeping and he prepares to take notes. However, they're all stunned to hear the same generic message. The private tries to keep the connection open, hoping for more, and after a long pause, the message continues. Hendricks writes it down as Baines decodes it aloud, and to Sullivan's surprise, it's his exact message. The engineer announces that the message message rebounded because no one received it, and wonders why the message wasn't received. Later, Cassidy and Sullivan inspect the satellite. During this, the private proposes theories about potential attacks on their homeland. He argues that natural forces may have changed since the Sentinel was constructed, making it possible to bypass the outpost. Upon hearing Cassidy's vehement denial, he regrets his words, remembering that the corporal has family back home. In his quarters, Hendrix continues plotting Aurora's course. Meanwhile, Bane sneaks onto the vessel with his tools. Later, Sullivan is bringing water to the gallery when he notices that Baines is missing. He looks around and moments later, the engineer returns. The exasperated private resumes his chores, but the engineer calls him back, revealing a bottle of alcohol. The men bond over drinks, and Baines opens up about his wife Elizabeth, who believes Northlanders have long died out. Sullivan then speculates whether Southland believes they've detonated Martha. Baines assures him that Martha's explosion would be impossible to miss, even capable of destroying the 2 remaining continents. Hearing this, Sullivan starts worrying about the animals, saying they don't deserve that fate. Then, Baines asks the private what if the Aurora was still functional. Later, drunk Sullivan wakes Cassidy to inform her that Baines is repairing the boat, and they'll leave in 3 days to maximize time before the next storm. The next day, Hendrix notices that Cassidy looks troubled. Meanwhile, Baines successfully jumpstarts the Aurora. However, as the men disembark, they find Hendrix waiting for them. The sergeant congratulates them. Then he orders that they start dismantling the Aurora immediately. Baines protests and Sullivan announces that leaving tomorrow is their only chance to get home before the next storm cycle. He attempts a mutiny, declaring they're not willing to die like Hendrix's previous squad. However, it's quickly stifled when Hendrix reveals his gun. Dejected, they march back in. Unsure of what to do, Cassidy tells them she'll handle Hendrix. On Aurora, Hendrix is busy dismantling parts when the corporal approaches him. She tells the sergeant that soldiers can't obey orders they don't understand. Hendrix responds that their orders are to protect Martha, not to run away. Cassidy then expresses sympathy for the loss of Hendrix's previous squad. She tells him that nothing will bring those men back, but he can prevent himself from losing 2 more, prompting him to reflect on his actions. As Baines and Sullivan discuss desperate measures, Hendrix joins them. The sergeant notices the bottle of alcohol in the engineer's hand and, unexpectedly, orders him to get glasses for sharing. Moments later, Cassidy appears. Humbling himself, Hendrix announces that the corporal has proposed sending a status report back home. However, only 2 can go, and he informs them that Cassidy has volunteered to remain. Later, Sullivan confronts Cassidy, declaring that he's not leaving her, and they'll stay or go together. Cassidy then tells him that she doesn't love him and that their relationship is only a product of necessity. Stoic, he leaves the room, though the 2 show their true feelings once alone. As Baines and Sullivan are packing, Hendrix hands the private the report. Then, he answers his question about Northlanders, saying that there's virtually no difference between them, except that they have Martha and it must remain that way. Sullivan tries to convince Hendrix that they should all go home together. Instead, the sergeant apologizes that he has to leave Cassidy behind, surprising the private. Around midnight, Hendrix plots the final dots of Aurora's course and he's puzzled by it. Alarmed, he walks into comms where Cassidy is on duty. He stands by the door, but soon walks away. Moments later, the alarm blares, causing Baines and Sullivan to rush to the roof. Hendrix walks into comms and sees their radar registering an unknown vessel. On the roof, the sergeant reports the vessel's coordinates, while Sullivan is busy loading the gun. The engineer announces that he can't see anything on the scope. Meanwhile, Cassidy is hailing the vessel but to no avail. Baines is in disbelief that a vessel could have gotten so close without anyone realizing it. After the men fire a first shot, Cassidy hails the vessel several more times, then she realizes that it's moving further away on the radar. Panic sets in as she rushes to the roof. Meanwhile, Hendrix firing coordinates makes Sullivan realize that their target is drifting away, and it dawns on him that they're shooting at the Aurora. Hearing this, Baines is unwilling to obey the sergeant's commands. As Hendrix threatens his men, Cassidy arrives and reports the Aurora as the unknown vessel. Undeterred, Hendrix continues giving firing coordinates. First, Hendrix shoots Peter, then threatens Baines to fire the vessel. The engineer refuses, prompting the sergeant to shoot his earlobe. Still, Baines refuses to obey. Before tragedy strikes, Sullivan fires on the Aurora himself. Baines rounds on Hendrix, but before the sergeant can shoot, Cassidy knocks him out. They imprison the unconscious Hendrix in the storage room, with the corporal taking back Martha's keys. Soon, the engineer seeks revenge, and when Sullivan tries to intervene, Baines takes his frustration out on him. They then disperse, each grappling with their lost chance at returning home. The following day, the crew gathers around the computer, but still no response. Baines then announces his resignation and leaves. Sullivan suggests that they implement 12-hour shifts and try other radio channels to establish contact with Southland. Cassidy then opens up to Sullivan, confessing that her words were only meant to force him home. Later, Sullivan gives Hendrix some food. While there, he asks the sergeant why the sudden change of mind. Hendrix explains that the Aurora's course should have relieved them 3 months ago, but instead, they stopped right before reaching the Sentinel and changed course. Since then, the Aurora drifted aimlessly. He then raises 2 questions. Why didn't they see the Aurora when it was so close? And why did it suddenly change course? When Sullivan demands plan's elaboration, Hendrix pulls out a switchblade and begins carving the wall. He explains that the Aurora's curved course indicates that they were constantly adjusting their bearings. He theorizes that the sudden stop was due to the crew assuming they'd arrived at their destination. After the sergeant puts away his knife, Sullivan realizes that his actions were due to suspecting one of them as a traitor. Hendrix then reminds the private that it's their duty to prevent the enemy from getting hold of Martha. Later, Cassidy decides to show Sullivan her family photo. She tells him that the rainy picture is the only photograph of them as a family, because they all died in an enemy raid just 1 year later. As for Sullivan, he shares that he doesn't remember much from his childhood, except for constant heat. Later, Sullivan wakes up alone in the infirmary, with the Sentinel out of power. Meanwhile, Cassidy is asleep at comms. After Sullivan activates the generator, Cassidy startles awake to see the engineer behind her. During this, the private sees that Bane's workshop is in total disarray. The engineer advances on Cassidy, reciting words from his furniture book, and suddenly begins choking her. They struggle, but Cassidy manages to defend herself and flees. Unaware that Bane snatched Martha's keys during the scuffle, Cassidy runs to Sullivan, reporting that Banes has gone insane. Meanwhile, the unhinged engineer is reciting words from his furniture book over the PA. Sullivan reassures her that he's just drunk, but when Cassidy realizes she doesn't have Martha's keys, they rush to comms to prevent a disaster. The private tries to reason with him, reminding Banes that Elizabeth wouldn't want him to die this way. As the unhinged engineer enters the code to activate Martha, he suddenly stops and starts chuckling. He then starts to sob as Sullivan reaches him, letting go of the console. After Banes admits that he forgot the last digit, he reveals that Hendrix is missing. Sullivan checks storage and finds the window grill removed. Later, Bane stands in front of Martha laughing. The next day, Cassidy is on her watch duty. Meanwhile, Sullivan reads the sergeant's report. He skims through the pages, though he lingers on the last one, where Hendrix requests to extend his posting. As the routine connection engages, the private gives up sending messages. During Sullivan's inspection of Hendrix's quarters, Cassidy radios about an approaching storm. As they observe the dark clouds in the distance, the corporal proposes a salvage expedition based on the storm's direction. As they prepare to leave, Banes announces his participation. The engineer then reveals to Sullivan that Elizabeth was pregnant, though he doesn't know their baby's gender. Before descending to the lower level, he hugs the private, which surprises him, and then happily announces that he saved the animals. Sullivan disregards the cheerful rambling. After Banes leaves, the private gives the gun to Cassidy, and they kiss before parting. As Banes and Cassidy row towards the debris on the dinghy, Sullivan braces the Sentinel for the upcoming storm. While pulling out fish, he discovers Hendrix's body, shocked to see that he died of a gunshot. However, the body slips from his grasp. He considers radioing the discovery but remembers the sergeant's warning of a traitor among them. Sullivan heads to the infirmary to check Banes' file and sees that he's been evaluated as unsuitable for the military, but his engineering skills made him invaluable on the Sentinel. Next, Sullivan returns to Hendrix's quarters to check the exact time the Aurora began drifting. On the night of the Aurora's mysterious fate, someone left the Sentinel on a dinghy. A soldier on the Aurora expressed wariness at the Sentinel's unexplained disappearance since they're unable to locate it despite being in the area. However, her sergeant said if the Sentinel had disappeared, the Sentinel beacon would have stopped sending signals. The soldiers on the Aurora spotted a dinghy approaching them and alerted the sergeant. The sergeant hailed the dinghy, unaware that his radar had registered the Sentinel's beacon on the small boat. The sergeant hailed multiple times, but the person didn't respond. Then, the sergeant and crew welcomed the dinghy and unlocked the gate to let the person board. As the beacon glowed at the unknown person's feet, the person stood up and proceeded to shoot the crew that was meant to relieve the Sentinel. In the present, Sullivan heads to the roof and discovers that the beacon is portable. Next, he opens Banes' locker and rummages through his things. Then he heads out, checking how much time he has before the traitor returns. As the dinghy with the only one person docks, he heads back and continues searching Banes' locker, but ultimately finds nothing. However, seeing a calendar gives him another idea. He heads back to Hendrix's quarters, confirming that the date Aurora started drifting was on March 28. Meanwhile, the traitor has docked and is on the lower level of the Sentinel. Sullivan heads to comms, just as the traitor is climbing up to Banes' workshop. In comms, Sullivan checks the log and sees Cassidy was on duty that night. Soon, Cassidy bursts through the hatch, tearfully reporting that Banes had chosen to stay with the debris. She hugs Sullivan tightly, while he stands there motionless. That night, Cassidy is fast asleep in Sullivan's arms, but the man is too stunned by the revelation to sleep. The following day, the woman startles awake from dreaming of the Aurora. While getting ready, the corporal notices Sullivan's gift lying broken on the floor and curiously smells the inside before putting it back together with a smile. She radios the private to tell him about his gift, but there's no reply. Concerned, she exits the room and starts yelling for him. Sullivan finally responds, saying he knows what happened to Hendrix and the relief crew, distressing Cassidy. Initially, the traitor feigns ignorance, but when she hears Martha activating, she rushes to comms. There, she continues to pretend until Sullivan draws his gun, telling her that it never rained in Southland. Cornered, she confesses that Northland is sinking and her people will die if she doesn't gain control of Martha. Tearfully, she says that she only wants to end their suffering. Sullivan retorts that she's only only transferring that suffering to others. He declares that neither side deserves Martha and detonates it. However, nothing happens. The silence is interrupted by beeps, and a message appears on the console questioning what the animals did to deserve death. As Martha deactivates, Sullivan finally comprehends the meaning of Bane's last words. Later, they sit in silence in the mess hall until Cassidy remembers Sullivan's gift, a T-ball infuser. She places it on the table and it doesn't roll off, implying that Sentinel stopped leaning. After a moment of contemplation, they agree to work together to protect the animals and prevent either side from controlling Martha. They know it won't be easy, but they are determined to do what is right. For the first time in a long time, they feel hope for the future.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.